For decades, Angie Dickinson has been one of Hollywood's most graceful enigmas, a woman who walked through the golden age of cinema with elegance, confidence, and mystery. From the silver screen to television, she became a symbol of charm and quiet strength. But behind the beauty and poise, there were stories she never told, memories she carried close to her heart, and one of those memories was James Arness. To the world, Arness was the towering hero of Gunsmoke, a man who defined an era of television. To Angie, he was something much more. The two shared a connection that never made headlines, a friendship that seemed simple on the surface, but carried an unspoken depth that even those closest to them could feel. Now, at 93, Angie Dickinson is finally ready to talk about it. Not as a star, not as a legend, but as a woman who has lived, loved, and lost. In a rare, intimate interview, she opened up about the bond she shared with James Arness, what drew them together, what kept them apart, and the truth she's held on to for a lifetime. Her words are tender, honest, bittersweet. Because sometimes, the most powerful love stories are the ones that never quite became love stories at all. It was the late 1950s, an era of westerns, glamour, and a Hollywood that still glowed in black and white. Angie Dickinson was rising fast, a fresh face with undeniable charm, wit, and a presence that directors couldn't ignore. Across town, James Arness was already a household name, the steadfast Marshal Matt Dillon of Gunsmoke. He was tall, calm, and carried a quiet authority that made millions tune in every week. Their worlds weren't supposed to collide. Angie was moving between film sets and red carpets, while Arness was cementing his legacy on television. But Hollywood has a way of crossing paths when it wants to, and one evening at a CBS industry event, they met. Angie would later describe that first meeting with a soft smile. He wasn't like anyone else, she said. There was something grounded about him, something real. Arness, despite his towering frame and rugged appearance, was famously shy. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. And that night, when he spoke to Angie, it wasn't about movies or fame. He asked her simple questions about her family, her work, her favorite things to do on a quiet day. It was disarming, almost old-fashioned. For Angie, who had been surrounded by fast talkers and charming actors, James Arness felt like a pause in the noise, a reminder that kindness didn't have to be loud to be strong. In the weeks that followed, they began to see more of each other, not in grand public gestures, but in quiet studio corridors, mutual gatherings, or shared coffee breaks between scenes. The chemistry was subtle but undeniable. They laughed easily. They respected each other's space. And yet there was something unspoken lingering between them, a sense that they both understood what the other carried. Arness had his own scars. Years before fame, he had served in World War II, wounded in the leg during the Battle of Anzio. The injury left him with a limp he would hide for the rest of his life. Angie, too, had known pain, not the physical kind, but the emotional distance that came from being a woman in an industry that often prized image over heart. In that shared quietness, they found comfort. Angie later said, "We weren't a Hollywood couple. We were two people who simply liked each other's company." But those who saw them together said it was deeper than that. There was warmth in their glances, familiarity in their silences. Still, both knew that timing was never on their side. Arness was deeply private, protective of his reputation and his children. Angie's career was in full bloom, pulling her into the orbit of directors and co-stars around the world. They lived in parallel, each respecting the other's path but never quite stepping fully into it. Yet through the years, their connection never vanished. They would write occasionally, meet by chance, or send a quiet message through mutual friends. And every time the old comfort returned, the kind that doesn't fade with time, because it was never built on pretense. It wasn't romance as Hollywood defines it. It was something gentler, friendship laced with what-ifs, respect tied to affection, a shared understanding that some relationships are not meant to be lived loudly, but felt deeply. And for Angie Dickinson, that connection with James Arness would remain one of the rarest in her life, untouched by scandal, unspoken by the press, but unforgettable in her heart. Because sometimes, The strongest bonds are the ones that never demand to be seen. As the years moved into the 1960s, fame wrapped itself tighter around both Angie Dickinson and James Arness. For Angie, this was the golden chapter of her career. She had become a leading lady, the confident, intelligent woman who could light up the screen in films like Rio Bravo and later Policewoman. But behind the lights, behind the polished interviews and movie posters, Angie often found herself returning to one thought: James. Meanwhile, Gunsmoke had turned James Arness into a legend. Week after week, he appeared on millions of screens across America, embodying the rugged, steady Marshal Matt Dillon. Yet for all the fame, Arness remained a private man, uncomfortable with celebrity. He avoided the party scene, rarely gave interviews, and kept his personal life shielded from the spotlight. Friends often described him as a mountain of a man with the heart of a poet. He was loyal, patient but distant, a man who gave everything to his work but left little space for himself. And Angie understood that world better than anyone. When their paths crossed again, this time at a charity event in Los Angeles, they hadn't seen each other in years. Time had matured them both, but the connection was instant. Angie later recalled, "He looked at me like no time had passed, like we'd just spoken yesterday." They talked for hours that evening, not about Hollywood or fame, but about life, family, and the quiet ache that comes with growing older under the public eye. James spoke about how Gunsmoke had consumed his time. The long hours, the isolation, the pressure to remain the image everyone expected. Angie listened, understanding more than she let on, because in her own way, she was living the same script. People saw the glamour, she once said, but they didn't see the loneliness. The two began to exchange letters, handwritten, thoughtful, and often without the need for reply. James wrote about Montana, where he would retreat between filming seasons. He wrote about the peace of open land, the quiet mornings, the simplicity that fame could never offer. Angie would respond with stories from her travels, her thoughts about love, about aging in Hollywood, and about the cost of being admired. Their friendship deepened into something rare, something built on empathy, not expectation. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was soulful. Two people who had both felt the weight of being watched, finally finding someone who saw beyond the camera. There were rumors, of course. Hollywood couldn't see a man and a woman share something deep without assuming it was scandal. But both Angie and James ignored the noise. Their bond existed in its own quiet world, untouched by gossip, undefined by labels. When Gunsmoke ended in 1975, James withdrew further from Hollywood. He had done what few actors ever could, carried a show for 2 decades, yet remained humble and grounded. Angie, on the other hand, entered a new phase of her life. She continued acting, but also began to value privacy more than ever. In interviews years later, when asked about James Arness, she would smile softly before answering. "He was steady," she said. "In a town that changes every minute, he stayed the same. He knew who he was." That's rare. That steadiness became an anchor for her. Whenever Hollywood felt too loud or too hollow, she would think of James, sitting quietly on his Montana porch, surrounded by silence and truth. It was never about love in the romantic sense. It was about recognition. One soul quietly recognizing another, without words, without promises. And as time passed, Angie Dickinson began to realize that some people enter your life not to stay, but to remind you who you really are. Soft piano plays over old Hollywood photographs, Angie on a film set, James on the Gunsmoke lot, both smiling, frozen in their prime. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories. The years moved on, the headlines changed, and Hollywood, as always, reinvented itself. Yet for Angie Dickinson, some names, some faces, never faded with time. And one of them was James Arness. By the 1980s, both had taken different paths. James had retired quietly, content with his legacy, choosing the solitude of Montana's wide skies over Los Angeles lights. Angie, meanwhile, continued to work, her talent aging like fine wine, graceful, confident, and commanding. But beneath that grace, there was a quiet sense of reflection. She had lived through decades of change, loss, and transformation, yet certain connections still lingered like unfinished songs. When asked once about Arness, Angie said with a wistful smile, "He was the kind of man you didn't forget, even if you wanted to. He left a silence in you that never really went away." That silence wasn't about regret. It was about the rare stillness that certain people leave behind, the kind that doesn't haunt. It hums quietly in the background of your life. In the early 2000s, when Angie was honored at a film tribute in Los Angeles, she received a handwritten note, simple, short, and unmistakably from James. It read, "You always brought the light to every room. I hope you know that never went unnoticed." It was unsigned, but she knew. There was only one man who wrote that plainly, that sincerely. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she kept the letter tucked between the pages of an old photo album, the one that held pictures from their younger days. In later interviews, Angie spoke about how fame often isolates people. "You become a story," she said, "not a person. People remember your roles, your lines, your face, but not your silence, not your heart." James understood that silence. He had lived it longer than anyone. After his time on Gunsmoke, he retreated almost completely from the public eye. No talk shows, no memoirs, no publicity. Just nature, family, and the rhythm of a quiet life. Angie admired that. She often said he had the courage to disappear, something most stars couldn't do. In her own way, Angie had tried to do the same. She became selective, appearing in fewer films, avoiding the chaos of Hollywood parties and choosing peace over fame. Yet every now and then, she'd catch a rerun of Gunsmoke, and there he was, tall, calm, unshakable. The man she had once shared quiet conversations and laughter with. In those moments, she didn't see Marshall Matt Dillon. She saw James, the gentle, thoughtful man who never let fame steal his soul. Years went by, and contact between them became rare. But it was never gone. Once in a while, a mutual friend would mention that James had asked how she was doing. Angie would smile and say, "Tell him I'm still here." And then one morning in 2011, she received the news. James Arness had passed away. The towering figure of television's golden age was gone at 88. For the world, it was the loss of a legend. For Angie, it was something quieter, the closing of a chapter that had never truly been written down. She didn't speak publicly at first. She simply spent that day alone, watching the Montana sunset on her television screen, the way she imagined he would have seen it countless times. "I don't think people like James ever really leave," she said years later. "They just become part of the sky, part of the calm. And maybe that's why, even after decades, she still spoke his name softly, as if saying it too loudly might break the magic of what they once shared." It was a quiet afternoon in Los Angeles when Angie Dickinson, now 93, sat down for what would become one of her final interviews. The sun spilled gently across the room, catching the silver in her hair and the years in her smile. Her voice was softer now, not weaker, but full of the weight of memory. The interviewer asked her a simple question. "Is there anyone from your past you still think about?" She paused. Her hands rested gently on her lap. A long silence followed before she finally answered. "Yes," she whispered. "James." For more than half a century, Angie had carried that name quietly. There was no scandal, no headline romance, no photograph splashed across magazines, just a connection that existed quietly, beautifully, and deeply. James Arness was a good man, she said slowly, as if choosing each word with care. He didn't pretend to be anything else. In a town full of masks, he kept his face honest. Her eyes softened. He didn't have to say much. Sometimes he'd just look at you, and you knew exactly what he meant. That kind of honesty stays with you. Cut to old black and white clips. Arness on Gunsmoke, Angie on set in Rio Bravo. Angie spoke about how she had always admired his simplicity. He didn't chase fame. He didn't need to. He had a calmness about him, like he knew where he belonged, and nothing could pull him away from it. Then, for the first time, she spoke about something she had never shared publicly. "We almost worked together once," she revealed. "It was a small Western project sometime in the early 60s, but it didn't happen. I always wondered. Maybe it wasn't meant to. Maybe some things are better left as they were, untouched, unspoiled. She smiled, not sadly, but tenderly. He was one of those people who reminded me what kindness looked like. Not the grand kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that stays. When the interviewer asked her what she would say to him if she could see him again, she leaned back, her eyes distant but peaceful. "I'd thank him," she said softly. "For being steady. For reminding me that there were still good men in Hollywood. For being my friend, even when we didn't have the words for it." There was a long pause before she added, "He made me feel safe." "You don't forget that." The room fell silent. Even the crew, used to endless questions and rehearsed answers, felt the truth in her words. This wasn't nostalgia. It was love in its purest form. Not romantic love, not unfulfilled longing, but a deep, enduring respect that time could not erase. At 93, Angie Dickinson had outlived nearly everyone from her generation. She had watched Hollywood evolve, burn bright and fade. But when she spoke of James Arness, her voice carried the warmth of youth, the gentleness of memory, and the peace of closure. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. She simply smiled, the same way she had the night they first met all those decades ago. "People ask me if we were ever in love," she said at last. "And maybe not in the way they think. But love doesn't always need to be lived to be real. Sometimes it's enough to have known it, quietly, sincerely, and without an ending." In that single moment, Angie Dickinson gave the world a glimpse of something Hollywood rarely shows. Love without ownership, connection without condition, and the kind of affection that never asks to be remembered, but simply is. And as her words lingered, it became clear. At 93, Angie Dickinson didn't just speak about James Arness. She spoke about every bond that endures beyond time, every unspoken love that never fades, even after the final curtain falls.